You ready?
Yeah.
Ready?
Yep.
Fitz, what do we got?
Got a question from @ConnorPrice15. Where are the high-risk zones in your workload for injury?
Interesting. Okay. Definitely pitching one. We talk about it from the band's perspective discussion of our shoulder testing as well with the recovery cycle. So we'll start off by saying this. So really good research out there from Dr. Tim Gabbett showed that AC ratio is a metric that he created, did a lot of research on with rugby players. Showed that basically when you progress a certain amount, you are at a higher risk of injury or you're higher risk of fatigue, which is a higher risk of injury. The way that I would approach discussing this with an athlete is imagine I told you you're going to run a marathon, right? So imagine I said to you, you're going to run 1 mile this week and then 2 miles next week, and a progression to be ready for a marathon. Why would you run? Fitz, I'm going to ask you the question. Why would you run 1 mile and then 2 miles? Why not 1.5?
Progression is progression of a whole number. I don't know.
Yeah. So it usually sounds good, right? Yeah, like 2 miles, I can handle that. Sure, let's go 2 miles. We usually don't think about how much progression. We also don't think about like the rates. When we're talking about jogging, right? There's a much bigger difference between jogging and sprinting.
Yep.
So if I sprint a mile, I run as hard as I can for a mile, right? The overall like load of my body is gonna be different than if I just jog nice and light for a mile. So there's a whole bunch of variables that go into this, right? But one of the keys for us is looking at how much load we're changing over time. So if an athlete comes in, let's say he throws 5-inning game tomorrow. Well, the next day we don't want to go throw another 5-inning game. Nobody really does that.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that we want to be able to handle as a starter 1 start a week or 1 start every 5 days in pro realms, right? We have to build up our fitness level to be able to handle that. So in this case, the AC ratio it allows us to see how much we can do as we progress upward, right? So if I'm at a 1.3, we know that's kind of the threshold that they found to be kind of more of an at-risk. So if you go over that 1.3, you're at a much higher risk of injury. I think it was 26 times higher risk of injury that Dr. Gabbett found. So substantial evidence, and when we look at it from like a UCL standpoint, right? We have these forearm flexors.
Mm-hmm.
These forearm flexors, they become fatigued. They're a front line of defense to protecting that UCL. So if these aren't doing their job to contract and protect that UCL when we throw, that UCL is much higher exposed to the stress that we're placing on that arm. If we're looking at an athlete and we're trying to explain to an athlete how to best manage or mitigate that, it's number one, we have to have really quality data that tells us daily how much load we're putting on our body. Number two, we're looking at trying to understand that progression rate and plan a program effectively that is dynamic, that moves daily based upon what you did. So let's say I go a little over my allotted load today, right? Tomorrow, I want to bring down what my expected load for tomorrow was just a little bit to offset the idea that I might have been a little too high yesterday. So that's what the AC ratio allows us to do. It allows us to get a peek in and know when we are fatigued or when we're coming up on being fatigued. The idea is not to be fatigued, right? When we're coming up on being fatigued, we can then kind of plan outside of that as well. One of the cool things we've done with our KP bands, with our TISO units, we have a shoulder testing protocol. And we've been able to look in and see recovery cycles, 4-day recovery cycles for athletes. And so one of the really cool things, one of the studies that we did, one of the case studies, we saw a guy, we did 6 straight weeks of evaluating this guy. So he was starting on Mondays and he was relieving on Saturdays. And what we saw for the first 4 weeks was that this athlete came in, tested with us, and his shoulder score was like a 7, I want to say.
Like a 6-8 to start.
Yeah, it was around that range. So like let's say a 7 for round numbers. Yeah, right. Yeah. So 7, we'll say 7 for round numbers. So first day he came in, before he'd go out pitch, he'd test with us, shoulder test. So we're basically checking the output of his shoulder for that day, and he was at like so let's say a 7. Yep. Okay. So for the first 4 weeks he came in, he was pretty consistent, right at about that 7. The next day, 24 hours later, he would come in after his start, and he would have dropped that score just a little bit. It's like, what, a 6-7?
Yeah, like a 6-6, 6-7.
Yeah, it's like a 6-6, 6-7. So for all 4 weeks, he did the same thing. Fell a little bit 24 hours later. 48 hours later, he fell down to like a
6'1", 6'2".
Yeah, so substantial. So for us in our score, that's a pretty substantial drop. 72 hours later, after the start, he would come out of it a little bit.
Yeah.
And so remember, he was starting on Mondays and he was relieving on Saturdays. And so what we told the coach, we saw his velocity was dropping a little bit. We talked to the coach, said, hey, let's try something real quick. What if we didn't relieve him on Saturday? Mind blowing, right? But the coaching staff there at that school was awesome. Like they did a great job, and they were listening, and they were really in tune with the data. They wanted to learn more. And so what we did with that athlete is we actually took him off the relief roll, and we said, okay, we're going to give you the weekend to kind of recover now. And so the next thing that happened was week 5 and week 6. We see this athlete's numbers skyrocket on game day. So they go up to like an 8,
7, 8, somewhere around there.
It was pretty high, substantial.
Yeah.
So he goes from 7 on his first starts for the first start day for the first 4 weeks to now on game day, his readiness score for us, his output for the day for us was close to an 8.
Yeah.
And so he's more ready to train on that day. The unique thing was that he went through the same recovery cycle. He fell to the exact same spot 24 hours later, same spot 72 hours later, and then he came back out of it. What that tells us is 2 things. One is that we need to be really cognizant of that recovery cycle. Like, we really need to understand that recovery cycle, because if I go out and I throw on a Friday for a travel ball tournament, right, and my coach wants me to come back on Sunday, well, guess what day Sunday is? That's that 48-hour range. A lot of our athletes, when they throw that 4 innings and they come back on Sunday, they're at their lowest readiness, and they've been playing the field the rest of the time and not actually counting that load. Which is it's obnoxious. It's terrible, right? It's
Another
just
conversation.
Yeah, it's the way that the game's set up. And so my point though is that when we look at the bands and we look at that recovery cycle, we need to understand how to prep our body to be ready for its highest peak readiness on game days. Number 2, we need to understand we need to monitor with objective data. For example, in this case, having the sleeve to be able to actually look at what's happening and the stress being applied to your arm on those days, that's huge. That gives us the ability to prepare and plan as to what would happen if. So if I threw 4 innings on Friday, should I come back and pitch on Sunday? Okay, I see it here. No. Okay, that's not good. Let's not do that, right? And then lastly, when we look at, what are our bands, what are we seeing in this recovery cycle, it allows us to start to manipulate the days in between as well, which is just equally as important. So a lot of times what happens to guys is they'll spike their workload, and then a couple days later they'll go back out. They might take a day or 2 off. They'll go back out and they'll play the field that day, and they throw a couple balls from the outfield, max intent, and they spike their workload again. They didn't even know it because they weren't really planning. They weren't monitoring that workload, that base. So it's really important for us to understand those numbers, to see them objectively. From our shoulder testing standpoint, the research that we're doing there, we're really excited about it because we think we can provide some context around the individuality of each recovery cycle for each athlete. And then into the future, hopefully those 2 products kind of start to come together to show us kind of what we may not be able to see with a sleeve, we'll be able to see with a throwing sleeve. We may be able to see with our band stuff and some of the output work that we've done there. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but I know in certain cases guys don't know how to handle a spike, and they don't know necessarily why things spiked. But it's important that we monitor these things and we plan and program effectively to help you mitigate that. That's where I think a great program, well-written program comes into play. Not just a linear throwing program or not just a linear lifting program or these things have to work dynamically. We need to auto-regulate what you're doing on a daily basis.
From pitch counts to wearable sleeves to KP bands, come a long way.
Yeah, that's it. So, look, our guys, if you want to learn more, it's our Connect series. As I always mention here, it's our Connect series to learn more about this stuff. We do cover that in detail, but we're really excited about what the future holds for being able to put those things together for guys, and hopefully guys will start to understand the ramifications or the repercussions of what it means from a performance standpoint and from a health standpoint.
Yep. Sounds great. So if you guys have any questions for the KP staff, leave a comment down below, smash a like on this post, and keep an eye out for a question box we'll be posting on the story.
Boom.
Boom. Boom.
All right.